September 1944. The mist over the French countryside hides the rumble of engines. American Sherman tanks move cautiously through the fog, knowing that somewhere ahead German Panthers are waiting. The men inside those Shermans know the odds are against them. They've seen what Panther guns can do, but this time, something is different. This time, the Americans have a new secret. A shell so fast, so deadly, that it could turn the hunter into the hunted. The story of the 76mm HVAP round begins long before that misty morning in Lorraine. It begins with fear. The fear of every Allied tank crew that came face to face with a German Panther or Tiger. In 1944, German tanks ruled the battlefield. Their armor was thick, their guns powerful, and their range unmatched. The American Sherman, by comparison, looked fragile. Its gun often couldn't penetrate German armor even at close range. Soldiers called it a Ronson, after a cigarette lighter, because it lit up every time. When the Allies landed in Normandy, they had numbers. Thousands of Shermans rolling through Europe. But numbers alone didn't always win tank battles. Every time a Sherman met a Panther head-on, the American crew knew they had to aim for the sides or rear to even have a chance. Many didn't get that chance. Reports from the field reached the U.S. Ordnance Department. Our tanks cannot match the Panthers. We need more firepower. In the laboratories and factories back in America, engineers and scientists listened. Among them were metallurgists, the men who studied metals, their hardness, and how they could pierce armor. They knew ordinary steel rounds were no longer enough. Germany had advanced armor made from hardened materials that could shatter regular shells. The answer, they believed, lay in something much denser: tungsten. Tungsten was rare, incredibly hard, and difficult to machine. But it had one unique property. It could concentrate massive kinetic energy into a small point on impact. If they could make a shell with a tungsten core, it could punch through armor thicker than anything the Sherman had ever faced before. The U.S. Army called this new idea HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition. Officially designated M93 HVAP, it was designed for the 76mm gun used by the upgraded Sherman tanks. Instead of a solid steel shell, the HVAP used a lightweight aluminum body with a small, dense tungsten core inside. When fired, the light casing allowed the shell to fly faster, over 1,000 meters per second, almost 50% faster than regular rounds. That extra speed meant more impact, more penetration, and a better chance of survival for the crew. But there was one big problem: tungsten itself. America didn't have much of it. Most tungsten came from China, Burma, and a few other distant mines. The material was needed not just for tank shells, but also for cutting tools and aircraft engines. Every HVAP round used precious tungsten that factories desperately needed for other war production. So even though the weapon worked beautifully in testing, the Army couldn't make enough of them. At first, only a few rounds were sent to frontline units, often just a handful per tank. Commanders were told, use them wisely. By the summer of 1944, the Sherman 76mm tanks began arriving in Europe equipped with a few of these mysterious new shells. Tank crews called them tungsten specials. Some didn't believe the hype until they fired one. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of the famous 37th Tank Battalion, was one of the first to see their potential. Abrams was a bold, aggressive leader, known for leading from the front. His battalion had faced Panthers before and paid a heavy price. When he received the new HVAP ammunition, he immediately recognized what it could mean. In the fields of Lorraine in September 1944, Abrams and his men were about to put these new rounds to the ultimate test. The Germans were launching a counterattack with dozens of Panther tanks. The fog was thick, visibility low, and confusion ruled the battlefield. Both sides stumbled into each other's positions in chaotic fighting that would later be known as the Battle of Arracourt. At first, the Americans were outnumbered. German Panthers advanced confidently, believing their armor made them invincible. Their 75mm high-velocity guns could destroy a Sherman from over 1,000 meters away. Normally, the outcome would have been predictable, but not this time. When the first HVAP rounds were fired, the results stunned everyone. The shells sliced through Panther armor like a knife through glass. German tank commanders who had once felt safe behind their thick sloped plates suddenly found their tanks burning. One American gunner described it simply, "It just went right through him, in and out, and that was it." German radio transmissions captured later revealed the shock among Panzer crews. They began to ask, what kind of shells are the Americans using? For the first time, the feared Panthers were dying as fast as they appeared. Abrams' 37th Battalion fought fiercely through the fog and confusion, often engaging at close range. But the new HVAP rounds made all the difference. In just a few days of fighting, the Americans destroyed 86 German tanks while losing only 25 Shermans. It was one of the most lopsided tank battles of the Western Front. The Battle of Arracourt became a symbol, not just of tactics or bravery, but of American innovation. The German high command couldn't understand what had changed. Their intelligence officers reported that the American tanks looked the same. Same guns, same armor. But something was different about the way they fought. Behind that difference was science. Metallurgists and ordnance engineers back in the US studied every aspect of ballistics: air resistance, shell shape, impact angles, and armor composition. They discovered that even a small tungsten core could concentrate immense pressure at the point of impact. Combined with the higher speed, it gave the Sherman 76mm gun a new life. Reports after the battle confirmed the effect. The M93 HVAP round could penetrate 160 meters of armor at 1,000 yards, enough to defeat most German tanks, even from the front under certain conditions. Tank crews who once felt helpless now had a fighting chance. But despite this success, not everything was perfect. The HVAP shells were still in short supply. Many tank units didn't get any at all. Some divisions received only a few per company. A gunner might carry just 3 or 4 HVAP rounds into battle, saving them for the moment he saw a Panther or Tiger. Commanders kept requesting more, but factories couldn't meet the demand. Tungsten was too precious. Meanwhile, in Germany, their own engineers had noticed the shift. They tried to adapt by adding more armor to their tanks or by redesigning ammunition. But their industrial capacity was collapsing. Fuel shortages, bombing raids, and lack of materials meant they couldn't keep up. The psychological effect was enormous. American crews who had once feared German tanks now felt a new confidence. They began to attack more boldly, using better tactics and trusting that their new ammunition could save them. General Eisenhower, who had earlier complained about America's lack of effective anti-tank firepower, finally saw improvement. He noted that with HVAP ammunition and the new 76mm Shermans, the balance on the battlefield was changing. The once invincible Panthers were losing their advantage. By late September 1944, the fog over Lorraine had cleared, and the fields were filled with burned-out Panthers, silent proof that something fundamental had changed in armored warfare. The Germans had never expected it. But the story of the HVAP round doesn't end there. Its creation had set off a chain reaction, an industrial and scientific race that would continue long after the war. The lessons learned from those tungsten-cored shells would shape future tank ammunition, influencing everything from post-war American rounds to modern depleted uranium penetrators. And yet, behind every piece of innovation were the soldiers who trusted it, the tankers who loaded those rare shells into their guns, not knowing if it would be enough to save them. As the Sherman crews cleaned their tanks after Arracourt, they didn't just celebrate victory, they wondered what would come next. Because even though they had won this battle, the war, and the evolution of tank warfare, was far from over. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the world began to take stock of what the war had revealed. The Allies had won, but not through perfection. They had won by learning, adapting, and creating faster than the enemy could. The story of the HVAP round was a perfect example of that. A small, brilliant invention born from desperation, tested in battle, and proven in blood. As German factories lay in ruins and their once feared tanks rusted in the mud, engineers and soldiers began to study what had worked and what hadn't. The Panther had been a masterpiece of design. Its armor sloped, its gun deadly accurate, its range unmatched, but it was heavy, complex, and hard to repair. The Sherman, on the other hand, was simple, easy to build, and endlessly adaptable. And when armed with the HVAP, it had finally bridged the gap between numbers and power. The end of the war didn't end the race for better weapons. In fact, it only made it faster. Around the world, nations studied the lessons of World War II. They saw how tungsten, speed, and small improvements could change entire battles. America's scientists took what they had learned from the M93 HVAP and began to push it even further. They wanted shells that could go faster, hit harder, and pierce even thicker armor. But history had another war waiting. 5 years after the defeat of Nazi Germany, the world once again trembled with the sound of tanks. This time it was on the Korean Peninsula. In 1950, North Korean forces invaded the South, armed with Soviet-made T-34-85 tanks, vehicles that were themselves a product of lessons learned from fighting the Germans. The T-34s were fast, rugged, and had thick, sloped armor. To the men on the ground, they looked terrifyingly similar to the Panthers they had fought in Europe. The U.S. Army, caught off guard, sent what it had available, once again, the M4 Sherman. Many thought the old tank was outdated, a relic of the last war, but soon those familiar steel machines were fighting again. And once again, the outcome depended on what kind of shells they carried. At first, the standard armor-piercing round struggled against the T-34's sloped armor. Reports came in from the front lines describing Sherman shells bouncing off enemy tanks. History seemed to be repeating itself. Then, just as before, the HVAP made its return. The same M93 tungsten-cored rounds that had turned the tide at Arracourt were now being rushed to Korea. Tankers who had fought in Europe could hardly believe it. They were back inside Shermans, facing new enemies using the same secret weapon. When the HVAP rounds arrived, the results were immediate. American gunners found that their shots could finally punch through the frontal armor of the T-34-85, even at long range. Once again, tungsten proved its worth. In battle after battle, reports described how single HVAP hits could completely disable a T-34. Crews learned to aim for the turret ring or lower glacis plate, places where the armor was slightly thinner. When hit, the tungsten cores tore through steel and ricocheted inside, turning the interior into a deadly storm of fragments. But just like before, supply was the enemy. There were never enough rounds to go around. Tankers often had to ration their HVAP, saving them for the toughest fights. And just like before, they called them silver bullets. Still, these battles in Korea proved something important. That material science was becoming just as vital to victory as strategy or numbers. The American engineers began to think about what would come next. Tungsten was effective, but it was also expensive and scarce. They needed something new, a material that could deliver the same killing power without depending on limited global resources. By the late 1950s, that search led to something extraordinary: depleted uranium. Depleted uranium, or DU, was a byproduct of the nuclear industry. It was heavy, almost twice as dense as lead, and it had a strange quality that made it perfect for anti-tank rounds. When a DU projectile hit armor, it didn't just pierce it. It self-sharpened. Instead of flattening like steel or tungsten, it burned and sliced deeper, generating extreme heat that could ignite fuel and ammunition inside the target. The idea was born from the same principles that had created the HVAP: higher velocity, smaller penetrator, greater density. In a way, the M93 HVAP had been the ancestor of every modern armor-piercing round that followed. As the decades passed, tank design and ammunition evolved together. The Cold War became a contest of armor and penetration. The Soviets built thicker, stronger tanks, the T-54, T-62, and later the T-72. The Americans responded with new guns, like the 105mm and 120mm smoothbore cannons, and with new types of ammunition that could pierce any known armor. But even as technology advanced, the principles remained the same. The lessons from Arracourt and the fields of Korea echoed through every military briefing and every weapons laboratory. Speed, density, precision. By the 1980s, when the M1 Abrams rolled onto the scene, it carried within its gun a direct descendant of the M93 HVAP, the depleted uranium armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot round, or APFSDS. These long, dart-like penetrators could reach velocities above 1,500 meters per second and punch through any tank in existence. Inside the Abrams, tankers fired shells that owed their design to the same idea that had once given the 76mm Sherman a fighting chance: the belief that the right material and enough speed could make even a smaller gun deadly. Historians looking back at the M93 HVAP often see it as a small detail in the vast machinery of World War II, but its importance goes far beyond that. It was one of those rare innovations that truly changed how armies thought about war. Before HVAP, most believed that bigger guns and thicker armor were the only way forward. After HVAP, everyone understood that smart engineering could defeat brute force. For the soldiers who lived through it, those lessons weren't written in textbooks. They were written in fire and smoke. Men like Sergeant Francis Baker remembered the feeling of that first shot at Arracourt, the moment when the shell screamed out of the barrel and the Panther erupted in flames. That moment meant survival and victory and something else: faith in innovation. Even General Creighton Abrams, who went on to become Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, carried that belief into the modern age. The tank that bears his name today, the M1 Abrams, embodies the same philosophy: reliability, speed, and overwhelming firepower backed by advanced technology. The story of HVAP also reveals something deeper about how wars are really won. It wasn't just the courage of soldiers or the brilliance of commanders. It was the invisible network of scientists, factory workers, and engineers who worked day and night to create something new. Behind every tank that fired an HVAP round were thousands of hands and minds. Metallurgists testing tungsten alloys, factory women machining shells, and engineers calculating velocity curves by hand. When a Sherman crew loaded one of those gleaming rounds into the breech, they were holding the result of all that effort, a symbol of what America's industrial strength could do. In that sense, the HVAP wasn't just a shell. It was a promise that through creativity and determination, even the underdog could rise. After the Korean War, tungsten returned to civilian use, powering drills and machines instead of guns. But the knowledge gained from those experiments never disappeared. Every modern tank round, from NATO to Russian designs, carries a piece of that legacy. Whether made from tungsten or uranium, they all owe their design to the principle first proven in 1944. A small, fast, dense core can change the outcome of war. In military museums today, if you stand before a Sherman tank and look closely at its gun, you can almost hear the echoes of those battles. You can imagine the tension inside the steel hull, the smell of oil and sweat, the gunner's quiet focus as he loads a single HVAP round and takes aim. You can see the flash, the shockwave, the moment when the impossible becomes possible. For the German crews who faced it, the M93 was a ghost, invisible until the moment it struck. For the Americans who fired it, it was salvation. For historians, it stands as a reminder that war is often decided not by who has the biggest weapon, but by who learns the fastest. The Panther had been a symbol of fear, the Sherman a symbol of courage. When the two met, it was technology that bridged the gap. The HVAP round turned vulnerability into power, fear into defiance, and defeat into dominance. Even today, when modern tanks fire rounds that travel faster than sound and slice through armor meters thick, the same spirit lives on. It's the spirit of those who refuse to accept limitations, who believe that knowledge could be a weapon, and who prove that even the humblest machine, given the right tool, could become unstoppable. The story of the M93 HVAP round is the story of American ingenuity under pressure. It's the story of the quiet war behind the war, the scientists who fought with equations instead of rifles, and the workers who fought with hammers instead of guns. It's the story of how a nation's ability to think, create, and build became its most powerful weapon. And so, when the 76mm Sherman faced the Panther and won, it wasn't just a victory of tanks. It was a victory of ideas and of the belief that progress could outpace power, and that no machine, no matter how perfect, could stand forever against human innovation. From the fog-shrouded fields of Lorraine to the mountains of Korea, from tungsten to uranium, from the M93 to the M1 Abrams, the line of evolution is clear. The HVAP didn't just make the Sherman a Panther-Killer. It began a new era of armored warfare, one that still shapes battlefields today.